Onward to the horizon's edge!
The dust rose like a wall over the plains of Gaugamela, shimmering in the sun of an unforgiving October day. Beyond that haze, the Persian banners fluttered, thousands of them stretching farther than any Greek eye had ever seen. Alexander of Macedon sat upon his horse Bucephalus, his bronze armor glinting gold in the light, his eyes narrowed as if reading fate itself. Behind him, the Macedonian phalanx waited, veterans of a dozen campaigns, their sarissas like a forest of iron. On the far horizon, the King of Kings, Darius III of Persia, sat upon a high chariot surrounded by bodyguards, his horses snorting steam into the desert air. Between these two kings, the fate of an empire trembled. Alexander's generals watched him in silence. Parmenion, older and cautious, broke the stillness. The Persian line is too long. They'll try to envelop us. Alexander smiled faintly. Let them stretch themselves thin. The longer the line, the weaker the heart. He rode forward to address his men. Soldiers of Macedon! You have followed me across deserts, through mountains, into the heart of Asia. Today the world stands before us, and we will take it. The army roared, a thunder of shields and spears that shook the ground. As the sun climbed higher, Alexander looked across the field at Darius's chariot, a distant glimmer of silver and gold. There he is, he whispered to himself, the man who calls himself King of Kings. Darius stood in his chariot surveying the Greek army, a compact formation compared to his massive host. He had elephants, scythed chariots, cavalry from Bactria and Armenia, and tens of thousands of infantry. Yet despite his overwhelming numbers, he felt an unease he couldn't name. The Macedonian king was young, but he had already broken Persia's armies twice, at the Granicus and Issus. Today would decide everything. A Persian advisor leaned close. Great king, the omens are favorable. The gods will favor Persia again. Darius nodded but said nothing. He looked toward the horizon, where Alexander's small but disciplined army glittered like a blade. When the trumpet sounded, the plain of Gaugamela came alive. Darius unleashed his scythed chariots first, bladed wheels spinning, horses galloping forward in a deafening roar. The chariots charged, aiming to break the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander's front ranks parted like a tide. The chariots flew through the gaps only to be met by javelins and spears from the sides. Horses screamed, wheels splintered, and the deadly machines fell in ruins before they could reach the heart of the formation. Alexander's eyes blazed. Now! He shouted. He led his companion cavalry, his elite horsemen, toward the Persian right. The wedge of riders tore forward, sunlight flashing off their armor, dust swirling beneath their hooves. The Macedonians slammed into the Persian cavalry with the force of a storm. Spears shattered. Men cried out, and in the chaos Alexander himself fought at the front, his sword carving arcs of silver through the enemy. Bucephalus reared, hooves striking down men as Alexander pressed forward, his gaze never leaving the distant figure of Darius. Darius saw the chaos rippling through his lines. His right wing buckled under Alexander's relentless attack. He sent reinforcements, horsemen from Bactria, to encircle the Macedonian flank, but Alexander was already moving. He pulled his cavalry left, slicing diagonally toward the Persian center where Darius's chariot stood. His maneuver was swift and precise, as if orchestrated by destiny. Darius's guards formed a wall before him, archers firing a storm of arrows. Alexander raised his shield, the arrows thudding against bronze and leather. His men surged forward, screaming his name. Then came the moment that would be remembered for centuries. Through the dust and noise, Alexander and Darius locked eyes. The Macedonian's gaze burned with unyielding purpose. Darius's flickered with fear. Bucephalus lunged forward, carrying Alexander through the chaos until he was only a few dozen yards from the Persian king. Spears and swords clashed all around, but for an instant, it seemed that only the two rulers existed in that endless plain. Darius's horses panicked, rearing at the sound of war. His charioteer screamed as a Macedonian spear struck him down. The reins fell from Darius's hands. For a heartbeat he hesitated, and then he turned. The King of Kings fled. The moment shattered Persian morale. Panic swept through the ranks as men saw their ruler retreat. The vast army that had seemed invincible moments before now dissolved into chaos. Alexander urged his men forward, cutting through the retreating Persians, driving them toward the Tigris. The plain became a nightmare of dust, blood, and broken banners. By dusk, the battle was over. The ground was littered with the dead and dying. Persians, Greeks, horses, elephants. Smoke rose from burning chariots. Alexander dismounted, walking among his soldiers. They greeted him not as a man, but as something greater, as if the gods themselves had chosen him. Yet even in victory, Alexander's eyes searched the horizon. Darius had escaped once again. That night, the Macedonian camp was alive with celebration, but Alexander sat apart, his cloak wrapped around him. He thought of what lay ahead, the endless road east, the pursuit of a king who refused to face his fate. Parmenion approached quietly. "The battle is won, Alexander. The empire is yours." Alexander shook his head slowly. "Not yet. As long as Darius breathes, Persia still stands." Far from the Macedonian camp, Darius's small band of survivors rode through the darkness. His fine robes were torn, his face streaked with dust and grief. Around him, the silence of defeat pressed like a weight. A Persian noble spoke softly. "My king, let us retreat to Bactria. We can raise another army." But Darius said nothing. He stared into the night, his mind haunted by the image of Alexander's burning eyes, eyes that had seen through him. The next days were filled with exhaustion and sorrow. Villages once loyal to Persia now bowed to Macedon. The empire that had once stretched from the Indus to the Aegean trembled. Weeks later, Alexander crossed into Babylon. The city opened its gates without a fight, its priests greeting him as a liberator. The people knelt as he passed, chanting his name, Iskander the Great, but victory did not soften him. He still hunted Darius, moving eastward through deserts and mountains, across lands that had never seen a Greek soldier before. One night, under a pale moon, a messenger arrived. Darius was found, abandoned and betrayed by his own satraps. Alexander rode with a handful of men through the night, reaching a lonely plain where a dying king lay beside a broken chariot. Darius was pale, his robe soaked in blood. When Alexander dismounted and approached, the Persian's fading eyes found him. "You have won," Darius whispered weakly. "May your rule be more merciful than mine." Alexander knelt beside him. "I never sought your death, Darius. Only your crown." The Persian smiled faintly. "Then take it. The gods have already decided." As Darius breathed his last, Alexander stood in silence, the wind carrying the scent of desert and destiny. For a long moment he looked east, toward lands yet unconquered. When he spoke, it was not in triumph but in quiet resolve. There are still worlds to conquer. Part 2, 250 words. The death of Darius III ended an empire, but it also marked the beginning of a legend. Alexander ordered that the fallen king be buried with royal honors wrapped in Persian silk, beneath a sky that had watched the rise and fall of countless kings. The soldiers who followed Alexander saw something change in him that day. He no longer spoke of conquest with the same fire. Now there was a calm weight behind his words, a burden carried by those who have achieved everything yet feel something missing. He took the title, King of Asia, but refused to destroy the Persian culture. Instead, he embraced it, marrying a Persian princess and adopting their customs. To some of his men, this was betrayal. To Alexander, it was destiny, the unity of East and West, born in blood and ambition. Standing one evening on a high terrace in Babylon, Alexander looked toward the setting sun. The sky blazed red like the plains of Gaugamela. He thought of Darius, of Bucephalus, of the countless faces lost in pursuit of glory. "Perhaps the gods envy us," he murmured, "because we chase eternity and find only dust." The wind whispered across the empire that now bore his name, and as night fell, the world that had once been divided between two kings stood united, under the shadow of... The body of Darius III lay silent beneath the pale light of dawn, the desert winds whispering through the empty hills. His golden armor, once radiant in the sun, now glimmered faintly with the dull sheen of defeat. The great Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever known, had fallen not with a final roar of battle, but with a soft breath that drifted into eternity. Alexander stood over him, his expression unreadable. Around him, the Macedonian companions kept their distance, their faces etched with awe and a quiet unease. No one dared speak. For years they had marched behind this man through rivers and deserts, mountains and cities, and had seen him defeat armies many times their size. But in this moment he seemed different, not the fiery young king whose sword had carved empires, but something older, more solemn, as if he carried the weight of the world upon his shoulders. He looked down at the Persian king's still face and spoke softly. "You were not a coward, Darius. You were a man caught in the storm of fate." He ordered his men to treat the body with royal honor. "He will be buried as a king," Alexander said, "the last king of Persia." As they wrapped Darius in fine cloth and carried him away, Alexander turned his gaze eastward, toward the unknown lands that stretched beyond the horizon. His soldiers thought the wars were over, but in his heart he knew the gods were not yet done with him. The march east began again. Across the burning plains of Media and through the mountain passes of Parthia, Alexander's army advanced. Everywhere they went, cities opened their gates offering gold, food, and submission. The people had heard of Gaugamela, of how the Macedonian phalanx had shattered the might of Persia like glass. Yet Alexander was not content with submission. He wanted unity. He wanted something the world had never seen, an empire that did not conquer by the sword alone, but by blending the blood of East and West. In Persepolis, the ancient jewel of Persia, he entered the great palace of Xerxes. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense and the echoes of forgotten kings. The pillars were carved with lions, bulls, and gods watching from the shadows. For a moment he stood before the throne, the symbol of Persian power, and said nothing. His men waited for his command. Then with a slow motion he sat upon it. The soldiers cheered, but Alexander remained silent. The throne felt heavy, almost sacred. That night, as torches flickered in the halls, the wine flowed freely. The Macedonian soldiers drank, sang, and shouted their king's name. Some began to speak of vengeance for the wars Persia had once waged upon Greece. "Burn their palace," they cried. For Athens, for the temples they destroyed. Alexander hesitated, his thoughts clouded with memories of his teacher Aristotle, of his father Philip, of the endless lessons about glory and restraint. But the fire in his blood was still there, the reckless spark that had driven him across continents. He rose, lifting a torch. "If we must burn the past," he said, "let it burn with all its arrogance." He flung the torch against the silk curtains. Flames leapt upward, devouring the ancient palace. The golden walls turned to ash, the statues melted like wax. As the city burned, Alexander watched in silence, the reflection of the fire dancing in his eyes. But when dawn came and the smoke settled over the ruins of Persepolis, regret crept into his heart. He walked through the blackened halls, his boots crunching over embers. "What have I done?" he murmured. "I have destroyed what I came to rule." He forbade any further burning. The empire would not be ruled by vengeance. From that day on, he began to wear Persian robes, to learn their language, to adopt their customs. He married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, not for politics but out of a strange, fierce love. She was wild and proud, as untamed as the lands he conquered, the Macedonian generals whispered behind his back. Some said he was becoming too Persian, that he had forgotten who he was. Others feared the way he looked eastward with the same hunger he once had for the West. "Have we not conquered enough?" Parmenion asked him one evening. "There's nothing left, Alexander. Let the men rest." Alexander turned to him slowly. "When the gods made the world, Parmenion, they did not tell me where it ends. Until I find that edge, I cannot stop." So they marched again, through deserts where the air shimmered like fire, through lands where no Greek had ever set foot. In every city, Alexander founded new colonies bearing his name: Alexandria in Egypt, in Aria, in Arachosia. Each one a seed of his vision, a world without borders. But the further they went, the harder the road became. The soldiers began to whisper of omens, of curses, of the wrath of the gods. The deserts were merciless. Men died of thirst and exhaustion, yet Alexander pressed on. When they reached the Hindu Kush mountains, snow covered the passes. The men froze at night, their breath turning to mist, their armor coated with frost. Still their king led them onward, his cloak wrapped tight against the wind, his eyes blazing with the same fire that had burned since Macedonia. In the spring, they descended into India, a land of rivers and jungles, of kings and elephants, of rain that fell like the sea itself. The battle at the Hydaspes River was like nothing they had seen before. King Porus, tall and fierce, rode a war elephant into the storm. his army thundering with drums and cries that shook the earth. Alexander faced him in pouring rain, his horse Bucephalus rearing as lightning split the sky. The Macedonian phalanx held firm, their spears clashing against tusks and shields. For hours the battle raged, man against beast, spear against thunder. When it ended, Porus stood wounded but unbroken. Alexander approached him, drenched in blood and rain. "How would you have me treat you?" he asked. "Like a king," Porus answered proudly. Alexander smiled. "Then so you shall be." He returned Porus's lands to him and made him an ally. Even in conquest he saw the value of honor. But after Hydaspes the army could march no more. The men refused to go further east. "We have crossed the world," they said. "We have faced every god and beast. Let us go home." For the first time Alexander saw rebellion in their eyes. He rode before them, his face dark with fury. "You would deny me the edge of the world?" he shouted. "You would turn back when glory lies ahead?" No one answered. The silence of thousands was louder than any roar of battle. That night, alone in his tent, Alexander sat before a map, tracing his finger along the edge of India. He realized the truth. Not even he could fight the limits of men's hearts. He ordered the march home. The return journey was worse than any campaign. Through the Gedrosian desert, the army lost thousands to heat and thirst. Sandstorms buried men alive. Alexander himself nearly died of exhaustion. Yet he refused to turn back, walking beside his soldiers, sharing their rations, lifting the fallen with his own hands. When they finally reached Babylon, the city rose to greet him like a god returning to Olympus. The streets were lined with flowers, the air heavy with incense. Musicians played as priests chanted his name in every language of his empire. He was only 32. Now the ruler of more than half the known world, Alexander should have been at peace. But peace was something he did not understand. The fire inside him would not rest. He planned new campaigns and to Arabia, perhaps even beyond. He spoke of building a new capital at the edge of the world, a city where Greeks and Persians would live as one. But something in him had begun to change. His closest friends noticed at first the sleeplessness, the restless pacing, the distant gaze. He drank more than before, as if to drown the silence of his thoughts. He missed Bucephalus, who had died after the battle with Porus. He missed Hephaestion, his dearest companion, whose death in Ecbatana broke something deep inside him. For days Alexander neither ate nor spoke. He built a massive funeral pyre and ordered temples to be raised in his friend's honor. Some said he wanted Hephaestion to be worshipped as a god. In his grief, Alexander grew harsher. Old friends feared to speak to him. The boy who had once tamed Bucephalus with a gentle hand now raged like a storm trapped in a man's body. Yet even in despair he dreamed. He spoke of the unity of mankind, of one empire, one language, one brotherhood of all races. His generals listened, but they understood that such dreams belonged to gods, not men. One warm evening in Babylon, he stood on the palace terrace looking out over the Euphrates. The river shimmered with torchlight, carrying the reflection of the stars. "I have seen the edge of the world," he whispered to himself, "and beyond it there is only the soul." Soon after he fell ill. At first it was nothing, a fever, a chill, but within days he could no longer rise from his bed. His generals gathered around him, fear written on their faces. The greatest conqueror in history, felled not by sword or spear, but by something unseen. As the fever consumed him, he asked for his army to be brought before him. One by one his soldiers filed through the great hall, the same men who had followed him from Greece to India. Each bowed as he passed. Alexander's voice was weak, but his words were clear. "When I am gone," he said, "do not mourn me. Continue what we began. Let the world know that there was once a man who refused to be bound by the earth." A silence hung heavy in the hall. One general stepped forward. "To whom do you leave your empire, my king?" Alexander's lips curved into a faint smile. "To the strongest," he whispered. Those were his last words. When dawn came, the light fell gently across his face. The soldiers stood in silence. None could speak. The man who had crossed continents, who had toppled empires and touched eternity, was gone. His body was placed in a golden sarcophagus and carried through Babylon as thousands wept. The streets that once echoed with victory now trembled with loss. Yet even in death his legend did not fade. Across Asia and Greece, people spoke of him not merely as a man, but as something eternal, the son of Zeus, the conqueror of destiny. His cities flourished, his ideas endured, his name lived on every tongue, and somewhere beyond the reach of time, on a field of endless sunlight, two kings faced one another again, Darius and Alexander, no longer enemies, but equals beneath the gaze of the gods. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying with it the faint echo of a voice. There are still worlds to conquer.